It's been a while since the last episode of Why Nobody Plays. The last installment was 7 months ago, which is kind of crazy. That one was about Destiny board, but tomorrow, actually, November 10th, will be the 3-year anniversary of the series. Way back in 2017, I made Why Nobody Plays Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, and while the series has changed over the years, the basic idea is the exact same that it used to be 3 years ago. We talk about iconic cards, or cards that have huge followings, or cards that have a lot of discussions around them, and talk about why they haven't seen as much success as some players think they should. In today's video, I wanted to talk about Witch's Strike. Maybe not as iconic as the other cards in the series, but still one that I see a lot of people ask questions about, and it really has not seen a lot of competitive play. Unlike some of the other cards in the series, it does have a few tops here and there, but not really to the level that a lot of people might think it would, considering that I know a lot of people that know a little bit about competitive play think this card should be played in a lot more decks. In today's video, we're going to talk about how this card works, because that is a pretty confusing part for a lot of players, and also talk about why it's not very good against big boards with monsters or big boards with back row. Those are two very different categories, by the way, and they do matter quite a lot when discussing Witch's Strike, so I want to talk about each of them individually. If you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe for more content, and if you've missed the other installments in the Why Nobody Plays series, there is a playlist on my channel. Anyway, Witch's Strike is a normal trap card originally from Savage Strike, and it says if your opponent negates the normal or special summon of a monster or monsters, or the activation of a card or effect, destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. This is one of the flashiest cards in the entire game when it actually works, and if you're someone that knows a little bit about modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you know that negation is all over the place. Hilariously, when this card was first revealed in the OCG, a lot of players thought this would be the end of back row decks pretty much forever. Back row decks consistently play cards like Solemn Strike and Solemn Judgment and other negation effects, and Witch's Strike is very good against those types of cards, at least on paper. In reality though, Witch's Strike cannot be used against a lot of cards that people think it can be used against, and also it's really not very good in most of the normal play patterns of a modern Yu-Gi-Oh duel. One of the biggest areas of confusion on Witch's Strike is when you're using it after the activation of a card or effect has been negated. That might not sound very confusing, but this card does not work against cards like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring or Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler. I know that might sound crazy, especially to a lot of players that don't understand problem-solving card text, but in the same way that Obelisk the Tormentor is only affected by cards that specifically say target, Witch's Strike can only be used on a new chain specifically after a card negates an activation. You might be asking yourself, well, how is a player supposed to know if Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence negates the activation? Well, it's actually quite simple. Do these cards say the words negate the activation? You can look on these cards for as long as you like. You can pause the video if you want to. They do not say negate the activation. They do say negate the effect, and I can see where people get confused there, because Witch's Strike looks like it might be able to be used against cards that negate effects, but it has to work after a normal or special summon was negated, or specifically when an activation of a card or effect was negated. That being said, there are tons of cards in the format right now that people use to negate activations. Things like BORRELOAD Savage Dragon or Appaloosa or Siphon Gear Gamma, or plenty of other cards like Solemn Trap cards. All of those things do negate activations, and in those cases, after your opponent did that, you could use Witch's Strike to take out their entire board and hand. And this might be confusing because I just listed a whole bunch of really popular and powerful cards that trigger Witch's Strike, so why isn't the card seeing more play? Well, that brings us to the second big issue with Witch's Strike, and that's that it doesn't really fit into a modern Yu-Gi-Oh game. Yes, the problem here is simply that it is a normal trap card, and I'll explain this in a few different ways. As a normal trap card, Witch's Strike is nearly useless, but as a quick play spell card in an alternate universe, the card is extremely overpowered and probably banned. I'm not sure if there is a legitimate unfortunate balance between normal trap and quick play spell where this card is actually usable but not broken. First up, let's talk about a situation where your opponent has a lot of monsters with negation effects. Now in this example, let's say you're going second, because that's pretty common in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If your opponent goes first and you don't open enough hand traps, your opponent is going to end on a lot of monsters with many effects that could trigger Witch's Strike. So why isn't Witch's Strike good in those situations? Well, the main problem is that you don't want to be setting a trap card in passing turn to try to break your opponent's board. In that case, you would much rather have a card like Ra's Fear Mode or a Kaiju or hand traps to stop the combo, or even Dark Ruler No More. There are plenty of ways to stop your opponent from doing those combos or to break their boards once those combos happen, but all of them except Witch's Strike also allow you to build your own board. This problem is amplified by the fact that if your opponent has a big board of monsters with negation effects, they will simply use one of them to negate the Witch's Strike. Sure, maybe you can wait for your opponent to negate all of your other cards and then hit him with that Witch's Strike at the very end, but at that point now you're out of cards as well. But you might be saying, hold on Dzeeff, I'm gonna play this card when I'm going first, because now my opponent won't have that huge board with multiple negations. While I understand where you might be coming from, when you're going first, you want to stop your opponent from making plays in the first place. You don't want a card like Witch's Strike that will break their board after they've made those plays. You'd much rather have Solemns or a Pointer of the Red Lotus or really any other forms of negation to prevent your opponent from making a board in the first place. So now we know that Witch's Strike is not good going first or second against combo decks that want to summon a lot of monsters. But what about back row decks? And I do want to mention here, while Witch's Strike in pretty much every single example is never really that good of a card, on average it is better against back row decks that are playing a lot of negation trap cards than it ever will be against combo decks with a lot of monsters. And in the 4 tops that Witch's Strike has had in the past year, which is obviously not a big number, pretty much every single one of those players was using it for decks that played a lot of back row, which generally included Solemns like Solemn Judgment and Solemn Strike. Once again, just like with the combo decks, I want to look at Witch's Strike going first or second, but this time against back row decks. So when you're going first against a back row deck, you are in a great spot. Historically speaking, one of the ways that back row decks have really been bad against the other decks is that they don't really do very well going second, because trap cards are very slow. You have to set them and then wait a turn to actually use them, so back row decks have pretty much always had a hard time going second. While people do side deck for going first against back row decks, usually people are much more focused on going second, because when they get to go first, it's a much easier matchup. So let's talk about going second against back row decks and why Witch's Strike is not the most optimal choice in many situations. When you're going second against a back row deck, you really do want to immediately force the back row player to either have a negation or lose the duel. Cards like Lightning Storm, Evenly Matched, or Harpy's Feather Duster are all better than Witch's Strike in pretty much every single way. No, those cards do not hit cards out of your opponent's hand, but they're a lot faster. They can be used right away, and if your opponent does not have a response to them, they pretty much lose on the spot. Once again here, the problem with playing Witch's Strike when you're going second is that it's way too slow. No one wants to just set a card and pass turn, but you also won't want to throw your resources into your opponent's negations when you know you have a Witch's Strike waiting for the next turn, which means you'll basically just set Witch's Strike without making any other plays and pass turn, because if you're using your cards to force your opponent's negations when you have a Witch's Strike set for next turn, that means your opponent is simply getting free advantage, because now they're just negating your cards when you were trying to use Witch's Strike to get rid of all of their cards at one time. I understand very well the dream situation for Witch's Strike. You try to summon a monster and your opponent uses Solemn Strike or Solemn Judgment, and then you flip up Witch's Strike and win the game by getting rid of all of their cards. The problem, of course, is that Witch's Strike is really slow. It's a trap card, which means you will already have to have set the Witch's Strike and your opponent will already have to have set the Solemn card, so we're talking about a very slow situation where both decks are not making a lot of plays in the early stages of the game. And in that case, I guess it's a slower control mirror match or a mirror match between decks that are back row based, and in those mirror matches there are other better cards you could play. If you're going first, cards like Heavy Storm Duster or Waking the Dragon are good choices, alongside cards that you're already probably playing like Solemn Judgment and Solemn Strike. Maybe even you play a pointer of the Red Lotus to counter your opponent's back row removal. If you're going second, you want to play cards like Evenly Matched or Lightning Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster, so in all situations, Witch's Strike is pretty much always outclassed. As with all cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!, if you play enough matches, if you play enough games online, eventually you will win some games, maybe even some matches with Witch's Strike. However, as I've mentioned over and over again, especially in this series, you don't want to play cards that sometimes win you games. You want to play the cards that win the most amount of games to give yourself the highest win percentage. Obviously, if you're just playing for fun or playing casually, play whatever you want, but if you actually want to get better at Yu-Gi-Oh!, you have to sometimes make difficult decisions, and in those cases, cards like Witch's Strike usually are not the most optimal choice, which leads to losses that could have been avoided with other choices. The final issue that I'll mention is that Witch's Strike only works if it's a surprise. If for some reason, maybe some metagame change or ban list change, Witch's Strike becomes a good tech card for a lot of players in the future, that would mean everyone would start playing around it and suddenly it wouldn't be good anymore. That's not to say Witch's Strike can never be good, it just means if it ever does become a great card, it'll probably only be good for a few weeks before people start playing around it. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say for today's video. Make sure to check out the Why Nobody Plays playlist, which is on my channel, if you guys haven't seen all of the other episodes. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.